If you've spent any time at all looking into, you know, high-tension geopolitical topics, the flashpoints, the military worst-case scenarios, you know the feeling you get. It's this
Mm-hmm.
rush of information that feels like it's designed specifically to create alarm, to grab your attention using what is basically a fear gradient,
Right.
whether it's about potential conflict zones or new tech. That relentless pressure can often lead to this kind of analytical paralysis. You know you need to be informed, but wading through it all feels impossible.
And that feeling of impossibility is, in a way, intentional. I mean, we are constantly seeing content that's optimized not for clarity, but for emotional capture.
Right, for clicks.
For clicks, for attention. And our mission today is to try and cut through that. We're going to give you a structured way to observe these sources, a framework, really. It's designed to analyze the material based on its structure, on the forces it describes, rather than just reacting and judging if it's right or wrong.
So the idea is to pull the analysis away from that gut reaction panic.
Exactly. And move it firmly toward reasoned plausibility.
Okay, let's unpack that. Let's simplify this. We're going to distill this down into a few critical rules. And the first principle, and I think this is a really tough shift for most people, is focus on structure, not impression.
That's it, exactly. When you see a piece of content, whether it's a long article or a 2-minute explosive video, you have to stop asking, do I believe this?
Or is this fake?
Or is this suspicious? Those are emotional impressions. Instead, you need to look at the architecture of the claim itself.
Okay, so we're prioritizing 3 structural things to pull out. We forget the headline. First, what is the causality? According to the source, what changed what?
Right. What's the chain of events they're proposed?
Second, what's the objective function? In, simple terms, who is trying to maximize what? Is it profit, security, political control?
Mm-hmm.
And third, what is the force field or the gradient? Where is all the pressure being focused? If you strip away the alarmist language, what structural force is actually left?
And that leads you right to our second principle. Treat emotion as a signal of pressure. This is, it's very counterintuitive for a lot of people.
I was going to say that sounds wrong.
It does. But when you see strong emotion, intense fear, outrage, even, that wild, aggressive optimism, don't just discard it as noise or bias. It's an indicator. It's a signal of pressure concentration.
So if a commentator is getting really emotional about, say, the global supply chain, I shouldn't just write them off as being hysterical.
No, you should treat them as a sensor that's operating in a high-pressure zone. You need to actually record which structure or which subject that emotion is being pointed at. Is the fear about national security, economic collapse? That intense failing is pointing you to where the system is under maximum stress.
It's like a warning light on a dashboard.
It's like finding a geothermal vent, yeah.
Yeah.
You don't ignore the heat, you measure it to understand what's happening underneath. The stronger the emotion, the stronger the gradient it's describing.
But wait a second. If I start treating intense emotion as a valid signal, aren't I just, validating the alarmism? How do I use that signal without falling for the panic myself?
That is the critical question. And that's where our third principle comes in. Grade plausibility, avoid certainty.
Okay.
The moment you start looking for 100% certainty, you make yourself vulnerable. Because when an uncertain prediction fails, you panic. So our system just avoids the whole binary of right or wrong.
Instead, we use a sliding scale for any predictions or interpretations we see. Let's call them plausibility grades. So first up is high plausibility.
Right. This would be for claims that are consistent with, foundational facts, and they're repeated across multiple structurally different sources.
Then you've got medium plausibility. The general direction is sound like tension is clearly rising, but the specific numbers or timelines they're using are maybe a bit aggressive.
Or overly pessimistic, yeah. And finally, you have low plausibility. And frankly, this is the bulk of the fear-driven content out there. It's usually heavily dependent on one speaker's personal assumptions, their own biases, and it often ignores key physical constraints.
So this shifts your whole mindset from, is this going to happen, to
how much structural weight is actually backing this claim? It's a different question entirely.
Okay. So once we have those rules in our head, we can start dissecting the source itself. The framework says we have to break every argument down into 3 different layers: the narrative, the intent, and the operational system.
Let's start at the top, the narrative layer, or N. This is the surface story. It's the official statements, the slogans, media rhetoric, everything political actors are saying out loud.
So in the case of, say, Taiwan tensions, the narrative is the official diplomatic language reunification, defense commitments, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Then just below that is the intent layer, or I. This is the deeper psychological core. You're looking at historical trauma, ideology, systemic fears, the long-term expectations that are really motivating the behavior.
So this is the stuff that's often unspoken.
Often unspoken, but heavily implied. For instance, the intent layer might reveal, say, a historical fear of encirclement is driving a military policy, even if the public narrative is just about defense.
And finally, the third layer.
And this is the most critical one for predicting actual outcomes. The operational system, or OS. This is the nuts and bolts, the actual mechanism of decision-making. We're talking military logistics, supply chain realities, market finishes, bureaucratic limits.
What can actually move?
It's what actually moves the world,
Yeah.
regardless of what the narrative or the intent layers are saying.
But isn't it true that for most sources, the narrative is like 99% of what we actually get to see? How do we even find data on the real operational system?
You extract it by asking structural questions. When a source talks about some new weapon system, the narrative is all about power. The OS question is, can they manufacture, staff, train, and maintain that system at scale?
Right.
When they talk about an economic blockade, the OS question is, what are the immediate financial countermeasures available, and how quickly can they actually be rolled out? The OS is all about physical and administrative reality.
Okay, this is where it gets really powerful for me. Once we've separated N, I, and OS, we then look at the speed dynamics between them. We assign a speed to each layer to find friction, or what you call shear.
Think of it like a geological fault line. You have OS speed, the pace of military action, industrial production. Then you have N speed, how quickly public opinion or political slogans change.
Or much faster, usually.
Much faster. And then, critically, you have what we call reality speed, or R speed. These are the hard physical constraints. Demographics, geography, how long it takes to build a factory, things that don't change overnight.
And the crucial insight here is that the speed difference, the shear, is the source of all the major instability.
That's it. You have to identify which layer is moving too fast and which is lagging. For example, if the political narrative about, say, an arms race is just skyrocketing, but the industrial reality speed, the ability to actually make the parts, is lagging way behind, that shear builds up massive, unstable pressure.
That gap creates friction. And when that friction gets hot enough,
It causes an unpredictable jump, a nonlinear event. You can often predict where the trouble will come from just by seeing that imbalance.
and building on that idea of friction, you introduce the concept of the membrane.
Right. We treat any high-tension contact, a point of border, the US-EU security relationship, the global semiconductor supply chain, we treat it as a membrane, a contact surface.
And your job as an analyst is to figure out which membrane is under the most tension from what you're reading. Is it pulling apart like a fragmenting alliance? Is it cracking like a trade deal failing?
Or is it hardening like a key technology becoming strictly nationalized? These membranes are where the system's stress becomes visible.
This analysis of structure and tension then brings us back to the whole idea of force fields or gradients. Since we know emotion signals pressure, we now need to categorize what kind of force is being applied.
We look for a few fundamental gradients that always pop up. There's the power gradient, an imbalance in strength. And then there's the one that just dominates geopolitical content, the fear gradient.
The imbalance of risk perception.
Exactly. But there are others too. The hope gain gradient, where concentrated profits are driving the action, and the time pressure gradient, who is operating under a strict deadline.
Like when a country needs a resource before a competitor's new tech comes online.
That's a perfect example of a time pressure gradient. And we also look for a compatibility gradient. This describes the friction when two fundamentally different operational systems have to interact.
So like a centralized state planning system trying to interface with the decentralized quarterly market system.
Huge friction. So the question you always have to ask is, what specific structural force does this strong emotion translate into? And, crucially, for whom is it a gradient?
Now let's talk about the people who create all this content. The analysts, the commentators. We can't just take them at face value. We need to treat them as part of the analysis itself.
Right, using what we call the observer model. The speaker isn't an oracle of truth. They are a sensor OS that is reacting to tension.
And this protects you from just absorbing their panic.
It does. We estimate the observer using 4 key variables. First, firing intensity. On a scale of 0 to 1, how often do they use words like crisis, imminent, catastrophe? It shows how close they feel to a critical point.
Second, the dissonance vector. How far does their view deviate from the general consensus? Are they an outlier, or are they just confirming what everyone else is saying?
Third is the sheer origin vector. Which structural layer narrative, intent, or OS is the one that triggered their strong reaction? Did they panic because their ideology was challenged, or because the logistics facts on the ground fundamentally shifted?
And the final variable, the entropy gradient, which sounds complicated.
It just measures the distance of their extrapolation, their guesswork. If the current facts suggest, say, 5% inflation, but the analyst is modeling total social collapse,
That's a massive leap.
that's a high entropy gradient, a huge jump in guesswork. And the key takeaway from all this is simple. High firing intensity doesn't mean the person is wrong, but it absolutely means they are touching a highly tensioned membrane that is specific to their own observation OS.
They're reflecting a local stress that might not be universal.
Precisely.
Okay, so with all this data collected, the layers, the shears, the gradients, the observer analysis, we get to the final steps. And first, we have to separate what is controllable from what is uncontrollable.
You have to know which areas can actually be manipulated by policy, by markets, by technology, and
Yeah.
which are basically fixed, history, geography, the laws of physics.
No amount of political rhetoric changes the physics of an amphibious landing.
Not one bit. And then comes the really powerful predictive part, organizing intention versus phenomenon. What did the actors want to do based on their intent versus what actually happened? The observable phenomenon, troop movements, price shifts, diplomatic failures.
And your final crucial step is to detect the gap between that stated intent and the actual observable outcome.
That gap is everything. That difference is where the system is failing, where pressure is building, and that is where you should focus your next prediction, because that gap is what predicts a future nonlinear jump, a correction.
So this whole structured process, it synthesizes everything into one final, robust conclusion. You have the facts, you have the plausibility grades, the NIOS layers, the friction points.
And you have the context of the observer. And it all leads to the single most important summary sentence required by this whole framework. After all that analysis, you have to ask and answer one question. Where is the quasi-critical point?
Where is the quasi-critical point? Meaning, based on all the tension, all the shear, all the gradients you've observed, where is the system closest to a sudden, unpredictable, nonlinear state change? You're defining the point of maximum risk using structure, not just fear.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It means this framework lets you dissect the structural facts and, yes, the emotional manipulation that's often hidden inside this fear-driven content. It ensures your analysis is based on structure and probability, not impulse.
It's how you reclaim your analytical freedom from the panic cycle.
That's it.
And so here's a final thought for you to explore on your own, one that builds on this whole idea of gradients. Now that you can identify a fear gradient, start observing the broader system and ask yourself this one critical question. If emotional language is designed to optimize attention and action, what is the underlying structure, be it industry, a policy, a market, that actually profits from the persistence of that specific gradient? Following the money or the power often reveals why the fear just won't seem to go away.